My aunt expected me to fund her daughter's luxury wedding. If someone had told me 5 years ago that a family member would try to hand me the bill for a six-figure wedding I wasn't even part of, I would have laughed. Then my aunt called. It started with what sounded like an innocent invitation to lunch. She insisted we hadn't caught up in ages and wanted to celebrate my recent promotion. That should have been my first clue, because she had never cared much about my career before. I arrived at the restaurant and found not just my aunt, but also my cousin, her daughter, and a stack of bridal magazines spread across the table. Before I could even order a drink, they were talking about flower walls, imported desserts, designer dresses, and a venue that looked more like a palace than a hotel. I smiled and congratulated my cousin on the engagement. She barely looked up from her phone before saying, "It's going to be the wedding of the year." My aunt nodded proudly. "Oh, it has to be." People have expectations. I didn't know who people were, but apparently they had very expensive taste. For the next hour, I mostly listened. Every idea sounded more extravagant than the last. Live musicians from another city, a custom ice sculpture, personalized welcome boxes for every guest, fireworks at the reception. At one point, I joked, "This sounds like it costs more than buying a house." Neither of them laughed. Instead, my aunt looked directly at me and said, "That's actually why we wanted to talk." I instantly got that sinking feeling. She leaned across the table and lowered her voice. "Always done well financially, and family should help family." I nodded cautiously. "Of course, within reason." She smiled. "We were hoping you'd sponsor the wedding." Sponsor, not contribute, not help with one expense, sponsor the entire thing. For a second, I genuinely thought she was joking. Then she slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. Every category had numbers next to it: venue, decorations, entertainment, photography, luxury transportation. The total at the bottom made me blink twice. I pushed the paper back toward her. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She looked confused. "What misunderstanding?" "Not paying for this." Expression changed immediately, not disappointment, offense. As her older cousin, you should want to give her the best possible start. I reminded her that I wasn't the bride's parent, and I certainly hadn't offered to finance an event this size. She waved that away. "You don't have children. It's not like you have other responsibilities." That sentence sat with me the entire drive home. Apparently, because I had built a stable career and lived below my means, certain relatives had decided my savings were a community resource. I thought saying no once would settle the issue. Instead, the campaign had only begun. Over the next week, my aunt called almost daily. Sometimes she framed it as an investment in family memories. Sometimes she said I'd regret missing the chance to be generous. Sometimes she simply acted as if I'd already agreed. Then things got stranger. One afternoon, my cousin texted me a photo of a wedding dress. Underneath it, she wrote, "This is the one I'm picking. Hope you approve since you're paying." I stared at the message in disbelief. I replied with one sentence, "I'm not paying." She responded with a laughing emoji. "I know you're pretending to negotiate." Pretending. They genuinely believed my refusal was part of some bargaining process. Soon other relatives began contacting me. An uncle casually mentioned how lucky I was to have enough money to change someone's life. A family friend hinted that generosity always comes back around. Even my grandmother gently suggested that helping might keep the peace. Not one person asked whether I actually wanted to. Then came the engagement party. I almost didn't attend, but skipping it would have created even more gossip. Everything seemed normal at first. People chatted, music played softly, and trays of appetizers circled the room. Then my aunt stood up with a microphone. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked the bride and groom. She thanked both families. And then she looked directly at me. "I also want to give special recognition to my wonderful niece, whose incredible support is helping make this dream wedding possible." Room erupted into applause. My heart nearly stopped. I hadn't given them a single rupee. Dozens of guests turned toward me smiling. Some even came over to shake my hand. One elderly relative whispered, "You're so generous." I didn't know whether to laugh or walk out. When I confronted my aunt privately, she looked completely unbothered. "Oh, I just assumed you'd come around eventually." I told her she needed to correct the announcement immediately. She refused. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. "If you embarrass me now by denying it in front of everyone, you'll ruin your cousin's special year." Notice she didn't say special day. She said special year. Because apparently this performance had no expiration date. The next morning, my phone was flooded with messages thanking me for my generosity. Some people even asked if I was planning to make a speech at the reception. I realized the story had spread far beyond that one room. By lunchtime, I received an email from the wedding planner. It wasn't addressed to my aunt. It wasn't addressed to the bride. It was addressed to me. Attached was the first deposit invoice. And according to the paperwork, I was listed as the primary financial contact. That's the moment I understood this wasn't just wishful thinking anymore. Someone had actually put my name on documents without ever asking me. I picked up the phone, called the planner, and asked one simple question. Who told you I was paying for all of this? The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to make me nervous before the planner quietly answered. Your aunt said it had already been approved. That's when I knew the real drama hadn't even started. I wish I could tell you that clearing up the misunderstanding took one phone call. It didn't. The wedding planner sounded genuinely embarrassed when I explained that I had never agreed to fund anything. She apologized repeatedly and admitted my aunt had spoken with complete confidence, even discussing payment schedules and upgrade options as if she had my full approval. The planner removed my contact information immediately. I thought that would be the end of it. Less than an hour later, my aunt called, not to apologize, to ask why the planner had suddenly become so difficult. I told her exactly what I had done. I explained the truth. She went completely silent. Then she said, "You've put us in a terrible position." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I hadn't created the problem. I had simply refused to let someone else volunteer my bank account. For the next several days, the pressure intensified. Relatives I rarely spoke to suddenly became experts on family loyalty. They reminded me that weddings only happen once, that memories last forever, and that money comes and goes. Curiously, none of them offered to pay. One evening, my cousin called, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said vendors were waiting on deposits and hinted that I was ruining months of planning. I asked a simple question. Why did you book things you couldn't afford before you had the money? She paused. Then she answered with complete honesty. Mom said you cover it. That caught me off guard. For the first time, I realized my cousin might have genuinely believed I had agreed behind the scenes. She had spent months choosing luxury options based on a promise that was never mine to make. It didn't excuse everything, but it explained some of it. The following weekend, the entire family gathered for my grandfather's birthday. I considered skipping it, but avoiding everyone forever wasn't realistic. The moment I walked in, conversations slowed. People smiled politely, but I could feel eyes following me around the room. Dinner hadn't even started before my aunt brought up the wedding loudly. So, have you reconsidered? I calmly said no. She sighed dramatically and looked around the table. I guess some people care more about money than family. A few relatives looked uncomfortable, others stared at their plates, then my uncle spoke up. Much exactly are we talking about? My aunt named the amount. The room went completely quiet. Even people who had been subtly pressuring me looked shocked. One cousin nearly dropped her fork. Another whispered, I thought she was just asking for help with the venue. She wanted everything. Designer clothing, premium catering, a luxury honeymoon suite, a fleet of decorated cars, custom entertainment. And somehow the expectation had become that I would quietly write the check. When I repeated that I had never agreed, my aunt accused me of changing my story. I reminded everyone that I had never once said yes. Not in writing, not verbally, not even by implication. That's when my father, who had mostly stayed out of the situation, finally spoke. He looked directly at his sister and asked, Do you have any proof that my child agreed to pay? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no proof, because it had never happened. I thought that public moment would finally end the rumors. Instead, they evolved. Within days, I started hearing that I was backing out of a promise. Somehow, refusing a commitment I never made had become breaking my word. The strangest part came a week later. An expensive invitation arrived in my mailbox, gold lettering, thick cardstock, beautiful calligraphy. Across the bottom, beneath the RSVP information, was a line that read, Special thanks to our beloved family patron for making this unforgettable celebration possible. No name was printed. But tucked inside was a handwritten note from my aunt. Everyone already knows it's you. Please don't embarrass us now. I read that sentence 3 times. It felt less like a request and more like pressure disguised as gratitude. I didn't respond. Instead, I put the invitation back in its envelope and left it on my desk. Days passed. Then another surprise arrived. A local bakery contacted me to confirm the design for the custom wedding cake. They wanted approval before starting production. When I explained that I wasn't the client, the employee sounded confused. My records show your billing information was expected later this week. Expected. Not received. Expected. Apparently, my aunt had spent months making promises based on money that wasn't hers. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't one misunderstanding. It was an entire plan built on the assumption that social pressure would eventually force me to pay. The wedding date kept getting closer. The bills kept getting larger. The phone calls kept getting more desperate. But for the first time, cracks were beginning to show. Vendors were asking questions. Relatives were comparing stories. People who had only heard my aunt's version were starting to realize there might be another side. The fantasy was becoming harder to maintain. Still, my aunt refused to change course. In fact, just 3 weeks before the ceremony, she made an announcement that stunned even the family members who had supported her from the beginning. Standing in front of everyone after a bridal shower, she raised a glass and confidently declared, "Thanks to our generous sponsor, every guest will enjoy an upgraded 5-star experience." Guests cheered. My cousin smiled through nervous eyes. And I sat there wondering one thing: had she actually signed contracts she couldn't pay for? Or was she still betting that public embarrassment would force me to rescue the entire wedding at the very last minute? I didn't know the answer, but I had a feeling we were about to find out the hard way. 3 days before the wedding, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. It wasn't family this time. It was vendors. The florist wanted confirmation that the final payment would arrive before delivery. The transportation company needed authorization to release the luxury cars. The decorator wanted approval to begin installing an elaborate entrance display. Every conversation followed the same pattern. "Sorry, there must be a mistake. I'm not the client." By the 5th call, I realized just how many businesses had been told the same story. Someone had spent months promising money that didn't exist. That evening, my aunt finally admitted the truth, not because she felt guilty, because she was running out of time. She showed up at my apartment carrying a folder stuffed with contracts and invoices. My cousin trailed behind her, looking exhausted. My aunt placed everything on my dining table. "Just need you to get us through this week." I flipped through the papers. Some payments were overdue, others were due the next morning. The totals climbed higher and higher with every page. When I reached the last contract, I quietly closed the folder. "I'm still not paying." She stared at me in disbelief. "Really let your own cousin's wedding fall apart?" I answered honestly. "The people who booked things they couldn't afford are letting it fall apart." Cousin started crying. For a moment, I almost gave in, not because I thought my aunt deserved help, but because I hated seeing someone overwhelmed. Then my cousin said something that changed everything. "If you just cover it now, Mom says you can think of it as my wedding gift." Wedding gift. A 6-figure bill, presented as if it were a thoughtful suggestion. I realized neither of them saw anything unusual about the request, so I stood up, handed the folder back, and wished them luck. They left without another word. The next morning, family group chats exploded. My aunt had posted a lengthy message about betrayal, sacrifice, and relatives who abandoned loved ones in their greatest hour of need. She never mentioned that I had never promised a single rupee. The comments divided almost instantly. Some people sympathized with her. Others privately messaged me asking if the story was actually true. I answered every question the same way. I was never funding the wedding. The facts spread, attitudes slowly shifted. People began asking my aunt uncomfortable questions. When exactly had I agreed? Was there a text message, an email, anything at all? There wasn't. The wedding went ahead, but not as originally planned. The imported flowers disappeared. The fireworks were canceled. The luxury transportation was replaced with standard rentals. Several decorative features quietly vanished from the schedule. Guests noticed. Whispers circulated through the venue. Some blamed rising costs. Others suspected poor planning. Only a handful knew the full story. I attended the ceremony briefly, sat near the back, congratulated the couple, and left before the reception. No confrontation. No dramatic speech. No public humiliation. I simply chose not to become part of the spectacle. For a while, I hoped the experience might encourage my aunt to reflect on what had happened. Instead, she doubled down. She told anyone willing to listen that I had forced last-minute budget cuts by refusing to honor my commitment. Months later, she was still repeating the same version of events. Some relatives believed her, some didn't. Many avoided taking sides altogether. The hardest consequence wasn't financial. It was relational. Family gatherings became awkward. Certain invitations stopped arriving. Conversations grew shorter. People avoided discussing the wedding because no one wanted another argument. One afternoon, nearly a year later, I ran into the former wedding planner at a cafe. We recognized each other immediately. She smiled politely and said, "I'm glad you stood your ground." I asked what she meant. She explained that after everything unfolded, she discovered my aunt had approached two other extended family members with nearly identical expectations before turning to me. Neither had agreed. I wasn't the first choice. I was simply the one she believed had the deepest pockets. Hearing that didn't make me angry. It just made the whole situation sad. The wedding eventually became another family story people mentioned in lowered voices, not because it was especially glamorous, but because so many relationships quietly changed afterward. My cousin and I drifted apart. My aunt and I rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary. Even now, when someone says, "Family always comes first," I think back to those months. Because sometimes the people asking for loyalty are really asking for unlimited access to your time, your energy, or your finances. And if you say no, they call it selfishness. The wedding happened. The photos looked beautiful. From the outside, no one would guess how much tension sat behind those smiles. But I know. Every centerpiece, every carefully posed picture, every toast reminded me of one uncomfortable truth. The most expensive part of that luxury wedding wasn't the venue or the decorations. It was the trust that never came back after someone decided my wallet belonged to the entire family.